This is the On Humans podcast with your host, Ilari Mäkelä. And today's episode is difficult to introduce. I don't know what to say. It's a very bizarre topic, but it's also a very serious exploration of a bizarre topic. My guest is Gregory Forth. He's an anthropologist who specializes in folk taxonomies, the way that different indigenous groups think about taxonomize the living world, especially living animals. He was doing this work on the Flores Island when one of the most interesting fossil discoveries of not human ancestors, but human species, hominid species living at the same time as Homo sapiens was discovered. This was Homo Floresiensis, dubbed the Hobbit by the media due to its small size. And when he heard about this, he was, in his own words, gobsmacked, because he had been hearing in his studies that one standard part of the biological taxonomy of the local Leo people is a very weird, bipedal, human-looking thing that is not quite human, not quite monkey. Something in between. That this creature is living in the woods. Very difficult to see, but people do every once in a while bump into one of them. They're supposed to be about a meter high, exactly as Homo Floresiensis. So what should we make of all of this? Could Homo Floresiensis actually, or one of its descendant species, actually still be alive? Or is this just another cryptozoology fantasy, a figment of the imagination, just as Bigfoot and Yeti? Should we just dismiss it like we do those? Or should we not dismiss any of them? Who should we trust? Whose testimony matters? And what would it be like to encounter a species that is half human, half ape? Too close to us to really be an animal. Too far from us to really be a human as we understand the word. If nothing else, this would probably cure anyone of the unfortunate way that we often still think about evolution as a linear process, one species leading to the next higher one. But what would it do to our ideas about human rights, animal rights? Would this creature be locked into a zoo, or would a conservation area be created for it? Is this one of the most deeply philosophical questions in anthropology? Or is this just two Westerners trying to find a mystery in the lands that once used to be part of the empire? I don't know. And at least one thing that's sure is that it's an entertaining story, and one that does raise a lot of questions. You can read the whole story from Forth's excellent book, Between Ape and Human, an anthropologist on the trail of a hidden hominoid. But here is my attempt to make sense of what's going on. So without further ado, I wish you a very good holiday season. I hope that this will give you some fun conversations around the dinner table. And I bring to you Gregory Forth. Professor Gregory Forth, welcome to On Humans.
Oh, thanks. I'm very pleased to be here.
What is Homo Floresiensis?
It's a good question. It's a bit of a mystery. It is a hominin, that is to say, it's the same family as Homo sapiens. It's been discovered so far in just one place, a single location on Flores Island, hence the name Homo Floresiensis.
Which is in Indonesia, right?
That is in eastern Indonesia. That's quite right. It's the 10th largest island in among the many islands that make up Indonesia. But Homo floresiensis was discovered with unearthed remains. Some of its remains were unearthed at a single location in a single cave back in 2003. And it was determined to be, by the discoverers and others, a new species. But what is interesting is that it's very different from modern humans. In fact, to use the terminology, it is physically primitive, which means that it looks like hominins that lived 2 million, 3 million even years ago. In fact, there are physical features of Homo floresiensis which are more comparable to apes like chimpanzees and even gibbons than to hominins. So it looked like something out of time. Initially, it was determined to have lived until, or rather the ones at the discovery site were determined to have lived until as recently as about 12,000, 13,000 years ago. That, however, was a single site, as I always emphasize. Since then, the discovery site was restudied, and the date was pushed back to about 50 or 60,000 years ago. Even so, that, of course, is during the time that Homo sapiens already walked the earth, and it is, geologically speaking, extraordinarily recent. So here we have, now I should also say that it stood only about 3 feet tall, well, about a meter.
Yeah, it was called the Hobbit by the media, right?
Called the Hobbit because of partly because of its small size, also because of its relatively large feet.
Okay.
The brain is very small, about the size of a chimpanzee. So one theory is that Homo floresiensis is a dwarf form of Homo erectus, which was in the Southeast Asian, Indonesian region, going back towards 2 million years ago, 1.5 million years ago. A very much bigger species on the whole, and that
And I'm bigger brained.
Oh, bigger brain, certainly, yeah. And that Floresiensis, according to the same line of thought, became smaller from a process known as island dwarfing, whereby certain species on islands with restricted food resources and so on become gradually smaller.
And which is fascinating because that happens not just on islands in general, but on Flores Island, I can't quite remember. Was it you had elephants that were half the size of the Asian elephant, typical ones?
Stegodons, yeah, an ancient form of elephant, yes, which were about the size of a water buffalo.
Okay, yeah. But you also had some massive. I mean, it's just such a fascinating island. You had also massive rats that are the size of a.
As you still do.
And they still do them.
Yes,
Okay,
you have the world's largest rat.
Yeah, which are what the size of a dog, or
not quite, but well, getting on for. They're about 80 centimeters. They can. Well, part of that, of course, is the tail. There is in my book. There's a picture of one.
Yes, there is at the end. Yeah. I love that. No, it's just fascinating to see that the way that Flores itself is this kind of mystery island where I mean the Komodo dragon is one of the most mysterious species for me. I remember from Attenborough documentaries. I remember when I saw an episode of the Komodo dragon, I couldn't believe my eyes. They look like straight out of a fantasy book, and they live on Flores Islands too. So you have these tiny elephants, massive rats, Komodo dragons, and you used to have the hobbits. And it really just play a little bit on that Middle Earth imagery. I think that what is also interesting to notice is that they were living the same time as Homo sapiens, right? And it wasn't just hobbits and Homo sapiens humans. It was also roughly the same time that we still had Neanderthals at least and Denisovans, right?
In other parts of the world, yeah.
Other parts of the world, exactly.
Yeah. That's right. I mean, as it's been phrased, the human family tree, it turns out, was never grown in a straight line. But it's branched, it's bushy. It's more like a bush than a tree. In fact, you could say, with of course, a lot of branches or tips. Of branches coexisting, at different times. So, I mean, it was once thought that things were very linear, and that more primitive forms were replaced, quickly replaced as soon as something, superior, more evolved came along. But this is shown to be misleading at best.
So, how did you first hear about the discovery?
Well, I should say, although I've been talking about Homo floresiensis, I'm not a physical anthropologist or a paleoanthropologist, somebody who studies ancient form of humans or hominins. I'm a social cultural anthropologist or ethnologist. primarily. I've been working on Flores Island as an ethnographer. One of my special interests on Flores has always been folk zoology of animals that share the territory with local people. It was around 2001 actually that I began researching in the Leo region, which is the setting of the book. And during the summer of 2003, I started to hear about the Leo ape men, who are the subject of the book, so-called Laihoa. And I heard about the Laihoa before or before anybody had heard about Homo Floresiensis. So I make that point to show simply that there's no possibility that the local stories, local descriptions could derive from somebody having read, Nature magazine or a newspaper report. In fact, I heard about it about Floresiensis, something about it from a Dutch member of the team in the summer of 2004, and I was sworn to secrecy.
And how did you feel? What was your first reaction?
Well, I was quite astounded because again I didn't hear much in the summer, but even at that point I thought, wow, this is very unusual. This is a remarkable coincidence. But then as I patiently waited for the reports to come out and the reconstructions, the paintings and the drawings and the measurements as well, the height and the brain size, suggesting, a rather non-modern human intelligence. I was quite, what's the word they use? Gobsmacked, very astonished. And I thought, well, yeah, I had actually, when I first heard about this in the summer of 2004, I was planning a book on these sorts of figures around the world. And my general assumption was that, these were got to be, purely imaginary and to be explained as cultural constructions based on relationships with the wild and all, rather standard cultural anthropological things. But the coincidence seemed just too vast to be a mere coincidence. At the same time, I couldn't, I didn't want to conclude immediately that, one thing immediately reflected the other. But I decided to look into that. I wrote a bit about it at that time, but it wasn't until years later, until 2014, when I had the chance to go back to Flores and the time to devote to this particular topic, to the Laihoa, particularly in Leo country, that I started again to investigate the field.
Yeah, I guess it's going to be quite, I think, clear to the to listeners which suggestion we are going to explore, which is the suggestion that could the Laihoa be Homo floresiensis or their descendants. But before we go into that and to the alternative explanations, I do want to ask, I did not know that you were planning a book on this kind of ape men figures around the world back in the days. And given that you were, I'm very, very curious to ask, how common or uncommon is it that on an island like Flores you have a large amount of reports, including recent eyewitness reports of something that resembles, a wild human, not quite human, not quite animal? Because I think that's quite an important question when trying to appreciate whether this is signifying something in the woods versus signifying something more cross-cultural in the human psyche.
In the forest of the mind, as they say.
Exactly, yes, exactly. So yeah, how common are these stories?
Yeah, they're found in various places. You have figures like the Himalayan Yeti, or so-called abominable snowman. You have the North American Sasquatch or Bigfoot. There is something in Australia called the Yowie or Yahoo, which may or may not be the same thing. But there's a large, physically large ape men, if you will, hominoid, human-like creatures. As regards smaller sorts, well, yes, they do exist as well. As regards islands, there are a number of instances in Indonesia, for example. The best known, probably the best known instance is something called the orang pendek, which means short man or short person, which is has been reported from Sumatra, which of course is a much larger island than Flores, but similarly, it's extensively forested and mountainous and so on in parts, especially in southern Sumatra. There have been a few reported sightings by Westerners of orang pendek. Villagers sometimes report seeing them. One interesting difference from Flores, though, with regard to the orang pendek, is that there are orangutans on Sumatra. There are also gibbons, including some pretty large gibbons. That's something we can't sort of fall back on to explain Laihoa or
Yeah, I see. But so there you would say that it might be that it's just that people have seen an orangutan or a gibbon and misidentified it as a more human-like species is a possible explanation in Sumatra, whereas it's not a possible explanation in Flores. Is that right?
Exactly. Yeah, very well summarized. Yeah.
But what about more broadly? I mean, if we just like let's say that you're a cultural anthropologist interested in folk zoology, and you have an interest particularly in these hominid creatures, and you are dropped in a new territory, just a new tribe somewhere. Is it so that you're almost guaranteed to have eyewitness accounts of ape men?
Oh no, not at all.
Not at all. Okay. Would it be right to summarize to say that it is quite rare that in folk zoology you have hominids as a species, and when they exist, it is very rare to have several eyewitness accounts of them living in present day?
I think that's fair enough.
Okay.
Again, I might just add that anthropologists, researchers of any sort, don't, and certainly professional, academic researchers don't usually follow this topic.
Yes. I mean, and I guess you mentioned Yeti and Bigfoot earlier, and I think those are the first things that would come to mind to many people. Oh, it's another one of those, and I do want to return to them, but I think it might be better to return to them once we have done more of the groundwork here. In what exactly do we know about Laihoa? What kind of sightings do we have? What are the alternative explanations to this very juicy, but perhaps not the first explanation that would come to mind to many people, which is the remarkable possibility that it might be Homo Floresiensis or its descendant. By the way, do I remember correctly that when you had a book open with an artist's remaking of Homo Floresiensis, of what we think that they might have looked like, someone walked past you and was like, "Hey, that's a Laihoa"?
Yes, that's right. It was a painting that was included in another book of mine that was done by an Australian artist, and it's been criticized as looking too monkey-like. But no, it stands upright. Its body certainly looks like some kind of hominin. And it was in another book I published, which one of my hosts in the Lea region, pretty early in my stay, actually came across, and he found the picture. I didn't want to show this around, obviously this picture, because it might spoil the experiment, so to speak, or muddy the waters at any rate. But so only he saw it, and he just casually said, "Oh yes, sure, that's what they look like." So this was, I should have mentioned earlier that this was one of the things that fascinated me about the Laihoa, particularly in relation to Homo Floresiensis. The resemblance with Floresiensis was that people said, they still exist. They're very rare, but there may still be a few about, and indeed there are a few people who've seen them.
Was it 24 eyewitness accounts that you were able to gather?
I think 27, yeah.
27.
Some are better established than or
some more reliable than others.
More, yeah, and indeed, I mean that's an important thing that one has to do as a cultural anthropologist is to take into account the character and circumstances of your informants, so people who are giving it the information.
And indeed, a lot of them are fantastical. I think it's worth saying, but when you drill down to the kind of naturalistic side of these descriptions, they often end up giving a height of around 1 meter, right? Which is the height that we think Homo Floresiensis would be.
Yeah, it varies, as you would expect, actually, from a living being,
Yeah. It's difficult when you have a whole very detailed book about eyewitness accounts is how to summarize them in one response. But what would be if you would have to try your best at summarizing what exactly do we have as evidence? And how do we tease apart the more reliable from the less reliable? What is the kind of data that you have gathered from the Leo people that we have to account for one way or another?
Mm-hmm.
How would you summarize that data?
Okay, well, we're talking about a human-like creature that people have seen, typically in or near high mountain forests, which is, their environment according to general descriptions. They stand upright. They walk upright on two legs. They are small, as kind of an average height of around a meter, it seems, maybe a bit less, but that would be the average of the various accounts. They don't appear wearing clothes or loincloths or anything like that, revealing dark skin, although not particularly darker perhaps than local people's, who are quite dark. And it's often said their bodies are somewhat hairy, although the hairiness is something that estimates vary. The head hair is interesting. In most accounts, the head hair seems not to be significantly longer than the body hairs. They appear to be, for the most part, wary of humans, which sounds like a good survival strategy to me for any species. For that matter, people say that well, they say they're scared of us and we're scared of them. They are human, but not really human. They're not.
It's kind of in the valley of the uncanny, right?
The uncanny valley, yes, which is another, another reason why people wouldn't hang around too often. They're typically, as I said, they're found in remote places. They're encountered. Nobody credible, at any rate, goes in search of one. And there's a notion that if you did go in search of one, you wouldn't find one, which sounds very mysterious and mystical, but indeed it can be understood. This is an expression of rarity. Another thing to mention with regard to appearance is that they're generally described as tailless, not having tails, as one would expect, of course, for hominin. At the same time, there is, especially in general accounts, there is a notion that they do have tails, which was a matter I had to look into, of course, and I do discuss this at some length in my show. Basically, just to give the conclusion of my interpretation, is that Leo and other Flores Islands, they classify Leo as animals rather than as humans like themselves. They conceive of animals of all sorts as having tails. In fact, they talk about them as I mean, if you want to say three horses, you've got to say something like three tails of horse.
Interesting. So tail is a kind of a part of the concept of an animal almost, which is very basic cognitive psychology, that you might then see things that...
Well, I discovered there was one very good eyewitness account of a dead specimen. which said it had a tail.
Is this the one where they hit with a truck?
No, this is another one.
Okay.
In the same chapter, though, chapter 7.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the man at first said it had a tail, a very small tail. Yeah, I was hearing this as well from other people. Always they have tails, but they're very small, right? But it turned out that this particular man, although he said it had a tail, hadn't actually seen the tail. So again, this is an inference from a folk taxonomy and local classification of living beings. Yeah,
which fair enough. I mean, is done by a lot of people. It's not I think atypical. I think you mention in the book that it's not atypical for people to mistakenly think that chimpanzees have tails.
Oh yes, no, indeed. There's a common misnomer among Westerners.
Yeah.
I do, in fact, in the book mention a plush toy, a doll that one of my granddaughters acquired of a gorilla, which is quite lifelike. In fact, she was scared of it for a while. In fact, it's very gratuitously been provided with a little tail.
Of course, yes.
Which I think, proves the point. Also, people who've been to, Leo people as well, who've been to Borneo for work purposes and who have seen orangutans and gibbons, another sort of ape there in Borneo, I think mostly in captivity, told me they had tails.
Yes, which they don't.
In fact, as one man put it, he said, well, they're kara, which is a word, an Indonesian word, which means both monkey and ape. They're kara, so they must have tails.
Yeah. No, it makes sense. Yeah. Personally, I was actually very convinced by the tail not being a problem for this is a real hominid hypothesis. I think what's more important is to go through what are all the alternative explanations. So one explanation you go through is that these are purely imaginary or supernatural creatures.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
One is that these are sightings of either other humans or monkeys, which are then mistakenly interpreted as being something between a human and a monkey. Of those two, I think the human possibility is a very interesting one because it could indicate a hidden tribe.
Yeah.
But we'll return to that. Am I missing anything?
Well, yeah. The other an hypothesis is that there is an undiscovered, academically or scientifically undiscovered species of ape.
Yes, of course, yes.
On Florida.
Yes.
But that's it's probably the least likely of all, as I'm saying.
Why don't we start with that? Why is it the least likely?
Apes. It's well established in biogeographical, zoogeographical circles that apes aren't found to the east of Wallace's line, which is a line that runs just east of Bali.
Which is very difficult to cross by it.
Well, yes and no. Some have crossed it.
Yes, including humans.
Hominins have crossed it, we know, including Floresiensis.
Yeah. How did macaques, by the way, cross it? Did they come with humans or did they come alone?
They came with humans. That's.
Because that's the only monkey. That's the only monkey, right, on Flores.
The only monkey on Flores is the long-tailed macaque, and that was brought with humans. That's several thousands of years ago. Yeah.
So if it is a mystery species, it is significantly more likely that it's a hominin species than it is another kind of ape species because we know that hominins have crossed that line.
Yeah.
we don't know that any other apes would have done it.
Well, quite so. And I mean, something I mentioned is that a few Flores Islanders have seen apes, some in Borneo, as I mentioned. Others report seeing apes, young specimens, typically it seems, that have been brought to local markets by traveling salesmen. who bring unusual animals, it's usually snakes, large pythons or baby crocodiles or whatever, to draw, to attract customers. They usually sell medicines or some such. And yeah, I had 2 or 3 good reports of apes being transported to Flores. It seems that there haven't been many of those recently.
But I think anyway, it's very unlikely to me that it would be an ape. Also, because if it's bipedal, we wouldn't only have to explain why is there an undiscovered ape species on Flores, but we'd also have to explain why is there an undiscovered ape species that is bipedal,
Well,
which
yes.
which is which is unheard of beyond hominins family.
So we'd have to assume there was a lot of additional fabrication to any ape that was cited, but no, there's some other things to say about that. I mean, for the ape to be a good candidate for a Laihoi, you would have to have them escape from markets or whatever and establish some sort of a breeding population. At the same time, if they did, certainly if it was possible for gibbons to establish themselves on Flores, these are arboreal animals and very vocal. So they would become pretty common. Some people become familiar with them very quickly. So they wouldn't be so hidden as Laihoa are reputed to be. So it's not a great hypothesis, that one.
Yeah. Well, what about then the supernatural or imaginary? And I have to say, let me actually ask before we go into that, how universally agreed upon is it amongst the Leo people that that there is this animal called Laihoa? Is it like everybody would agree that of course they exist?
Everybody I've ever come across, who share a spoken at length about these. He's familiar with the concept, as most people are.
Because the problem with here is that some of the accounts are very, very mysterious. I mean, sometimes the Laiho are seen with a white singlet, running in the woods, and sometimes they speak back. And it's actually quite difficult to find a single eyewitness account that would be without any kind of a spooky atmosphere, around it. So how do you deal with that?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, it's rather like the tales, actually. The Laihoa are described as animals, but ones with supernatural, unusual qualities. Now, that's fine, but in that respect, they're no different from other animals, or evidently natural species that Leo talk about. So while they do distinguish animals from spirits, the boundary isn't kind of absolute. The dugong or sea cow is one I mentioned in the book. It exists, certainly a rare animal in Flores waters, but people have seen it, and yet they ascribe various. It's supposed to derive from a human being, and to be able to reassume the form of a human being in rare instances, that kind of freshwater turtles, giant land crabs or robber crabs, which appear to be present on the island occasionally and in small numbers, are spoken of as being manifestations, embodiments, in fact, of forest spirits. Again, Laihoa men are interesting in that regard, because while they have their own supernatural character, and just meeting one can make a person sick, for example, some people say, they're not, it seems, so supernatural as the turtles and the crabs,
which are real species.
They're real species, yeah.
Another problem with the supernatural explanation are these people who report seeing something like a Laihoa in other parts. And I mean, I think here, and we need to be careful in how we treat this, but there has been a senior academic, right, who has reported seeing something that he first thought, was in the 70s, right? that he, or 80s, he reported seeing something on Flores which he said were looking like monkeys, but then he realized that they were upright and that there was something very bizarre and almost troubling, perhaps in this uncanny valley way. And he never thought about it very much. Do I remember this story roughly right?
You do. That's also in the chapter on extraterritorial encounters. In fact, it wasn't on Flores. It was on the next big island to the west, which is
Interesting.
Sumbawa.
Interesting, yeah.
It was the eastern part of Sumbawa, and up in the mountains. Yeah.
No, it is interesting. I mean, you're very careful in the book to say that you don't want to suggest that just because there is a Westerner who says that this has happened, it's somehow more valid than the fact that a Leo person has said it. But I think it is still a remarkable fact, because it's quite a far-fetched explanation that this person was so deeply invested in the spiritual, supernatural ideas of the Leo culture, which, as far as I remember, they wouldn't have had any contact with, and that they would have therefore told an imaginary supernatural story, nor that these supernatural ideas would have influenced them so much that they would have, cognitively hallucinated something that isn't there.
Right.
So it was, it did struck with me as very, very surprising.
Yeah, well, but nevertheless, there it is.
Nevertheless, yeah. But not on Flores. Okay, interesting. That makes it even more complicated.
Yeah. Oh, but we do have other sightings, extraterritorial sightings of things on
Flores.
On Flores, which is primarily the one by the two young men back in the...
Yes, the truck.
No, not the truck.
No, this was the other one than the truck.
Yeah, but also in the 1970s. Yeah, you've got the time right. But just to say one more thing about the idea of Lahore being supernatural, purely supernatural beings or spirits, what I take up a whole chapter, chapter 3, showing that the way Leo described and other Flores Islanders describe spirits, and the way they describe Lahore, very, very different characterizations. And I could go over all the details, but I'll leave that to the readers of the book.
Yeah, and for the people who are very curious now, what is this truck business that I'm always mentioning? So there was a group of people who told that they hit Lahore with their truck and killed it on the roadside, right? And they just left it by the road, right? They didn't have time to bury it.
The truck driver wanted to bury it, but the circumstances weren't right, so he did the minimal thing required, which was wrap it in a garment and put it at the side of the road. They planned, or he planned, to come back the following day, when at which time he wanted to bury it. When he got back, it had gone. The carcass had gone.
Well, what about then the idea that it's not supernatural as a spirit, but that it is just another Bigfoot or Yeti, where I don't know what you think about Bigfoot and Yeti, but a lot of people would say that, well, actually, why don't you tell me? What do you think of Bigfoot and Yeti, and then compare them to, compare this idea of they are not necessarily spirits, but they are somehow so deeply ingrained in the folklore that then you end up having these accounts, but it doesn't necessarily prove that the Yeti exists or that the Bigfoot exists. So how does this compare? Why is this not just another cryptozoology thing? Or should we say that actually, why not take the Yeti or the Bigfoot more seriously?
I think, well, several things to say. I mean, first of all, let's talk about the Bigfoot, Sasquatch. It's, as it's better known in Canada, and indeed it wasn't only Canadians, I think, before Americans. But Bigfoot is supposed to be a huge creature. Some people talk about 2.5, 3 meters tall. There are eyewitness reports as well. There is some grounding in the culture of local First Nations people, people who used to be called Native Indians. So what's the difference? Well, they're very big, Bigfoot or Sasquatch. So that there is, you would think, a greater difficulty of keeping themselves hidden, if that's what they wanted to do. Again, it's difficult to corroborate reports, but at the same time, with Bigfoot, people have actually gone looking for them, trying to film them, and so have never been successful. Also, we have to look at the cultural context, I think, and that is that some North Americans would have good reasons to want to be able to discover one and film it and write a book about it. And
Many people do write a book about.
well, there have been a lot of books written. Yeah, no, you're quite right. And I mean, that's another way, of course, in which information on Bigfoot, the image of the Bigfoot, is spread among, the general populace, and indeed around the world. Again, nothing like that in the case of Laihoa.
But I guess the fundamental problem here would be that I'm sure that there are self-identified skeptics who have a sophisticated cognitive theory on where the idea of the Bigfoot comes from. And I'm not the right person to say what exactly those theories are, but I can easily imagine how they would start from some kind of, you mistake something for one, the stories start to spread, and then, people see things that are not there when they like the tale with the Laihoa that we discussed, and leaving the details of those theories aside, how plausible aren't? What would you say to someone who said that these are still the most plausible explanation of Laihoa is whatever we're going to use to explain all this other cryptozoology, from Loch Ness Monster to Bigfoot and Yeti?
Well, no, I mean, a point I make in the book is that if Laihoa is a real creature, is a natural species that survives to the present or until recently, that doesn't mean to say that every other mystery creature that's been reported around the globe is, falls in the same category. I mean, with regard to the Bigfoot, let me just mention a couple of other features that distinguish it from Laihoa. Some more important features, I think. I mean, one is that there's never been found any skeletal material in North America or in places where Bigfoot are reported to be found that correspond to the image of the Bigfoot. Also, there are two species of bears present in places where Bigfoot are supposed to be typically encountered in British Columbia and Western Canada and northwestern U.S., which do occasionally stand on their hind legs. Could be mistaken, I guess, at a distance anyway. I've written about, not in this book, but in another book, I've written about Bigfoot, and I treat Bigfoot together with Yeti and an Australian figure as well. I do sort of come to the conclusion that the best explanation is that they are imaginary. And I talk about the 19th century discovery of gorillas and, in the European empires and stories and illustrations of these things getting back. There's a lot that can be considered in regard to Bigfoot. Again, it's another one of those things that marks it off from Laihoa.
And so, but Laihoa, you say your judgment is that the reports are more detailed than what we have with these legendary creatures like Bigfoot or Yeti, and there are more of them. They are more naturalistic. There's less possibility of there being other creatures that are mistaken for them. Or what's the main kind of quick summary of the reasons why they are less likely to be imaginary?
Well, I suppose some of those are the reasons, or the opposite of the reasons why Bigfoot are likely to be not what they're cracked up to be something imaginary or exaggerated.
Yeah.
I mean, another factor, of course, is that it's been shown that some of the evidence for Bigfoot tracks, especially Bigfoot tracks, have been faked. Now, there are some that appear not to have been, which is really interesting. Why it's still a question mark But these again are things that don't apply to people on Flores Island.
To Laiho. Yeah. Okay. Well, what about then them being mistaken? Like you mentioned bears earlier. It might be that, Bigfoot is people are mistaken bears standing upright for a hominin. The obvious candidates would be either monkeys or other members of other humans, other Homo sapiens. Monkeys, I think, is quite unlikely. I mean, monkeys, the macaques are pretty small with
They're small with a long tail, and they move on four limbs rather than two. They're also very common,
yeah,
and
yeah.
too common, you might say. People complain about. It's the one wild animal that a visitor to Flores is most likely to see. They kept as pets as well. So, the question arises: well, why would a monkey be the basis for a rare mystery creature, which in many respects is physically quite different? I mean, if it were a very large monkey and seen in unusual circumstances, a lone monkey, then possibly. But yeah, on the whole, the differences I think are too great. There is an interesting report in the book from two young men. They're still quite young, younger than me anyway, who thought they'd encountered a Laihoa, and as I said, they saw it together. It seems and they experienced something of the emotional reaction that other people report when they see this, by all accounts, by their own descriptions, this creature was a large monkey. It may have had a shortish tail, but yeah, all the evidence points to this being a monkey. There's also evidence suggesting that these two young men, they're much younger at the time, they're out hunting monkeys, by the way. That they only became to think that it was a Laihoa after they reported it to older people, reported it describing their emotional reactions and various other things which interested me particularly. And indeed, there were other a few other eyewitness accounts, which I suggest were probably monkeys. Again, in odd places and in unusual circumstances. And
Yeah. Well, what about Homo sapiens?
yeah, it would have to be Homo sapiens. It would have to be a group of Homo sapiens that are living separately from Leo up in mountain forests, that were physically and culturally different. From they looked exactly like Leo, then I don't think you can continue following that hypothesis. So they would have to be physically smaller, or they'd have to wear fewer clothes or no clothes at all. It's not impossible.
Yeah, it does not strike impossible. It does not
No,
strike me
not at
impossible.
all.
Unlikely, but we only have unlikely explanations. I mean, certainly there would have to be then this kind of exaggeration effect on how small they are.
And monkey-like as well. Yeah.
Yeah. But I guess their tail discussion would kind of come back in that it's not unheard of to witness another group of humans and in some sense denigrate them to being half animals, and maybe exaggerating some of the ways that you differ from them, perhaps.
Very common.
And
Yeah.
and exaggerate things that you think make them animal-like.
I do come up with a particular hypothesis in regard to other humans, and that is that a question whether Laihoa couldn't reflect something like Southeast Asian pygmies, as they're still called, who we know live in the Philippines and in the Malay Peninsula in Western Malaysia. There has been speculation over a long period as to whether they were ever on Borneo or other islands in Indonesia, Indeed, why shouldn't they be? There's no reason why they shouldn't be. And I also point out, along the lines you were suggesting a moment ago, that pygmies have been reported by other people, including neighboring people, as being animal-like, as having tails. Indeed, in the case of African pygmies, as being more closely related to chimpanzees than to taller Africans. So this starts to sound plausible. But there are counters, and indeed one of those is that wherever they're found, they do regularly relate to, interact with other people, non-pygmies. So it remains a very interesting hypothesis, but there are lots of things more than you might at first expect. Several things that go against it.
Yeah, it is fascinating, and the book is written, I think, in a way in that you take this indigenous taxonomy very seriously. I think that there's a lot of people trained in anthropology who would want to treat it in a very respectful way, but almost ironically that becomes then the kind of, well, they're not talking about anything real, we shouldn't try to understand them in semi-science way. I think in a way you show a lot of respect for them because you take it actually seriously.
Very well, that tends to be the approach, that they live in a sort of a separate reality from the West.
I guess then the question is, well, could the Laihoa be Homo Floresiensis or their descendants? What would be the counter argument from the field who say that, well, it just cannot be Homo Floresiensis? What are the best arguments that you hear?
The best arguments, well, of course, the commonest argument is that it goes something like, well, if they did exist as biological beings, specimens would have been discovered by now. Somebody would have seen one, somebody would have found one, somebody would have caught one. That logically, you're a philosopher, that's not a very good argument, because things have been encountered out of the blue.
And hang on, and the Leo people, according to their own words, have encountered. You have 27 people who have encountered them.
Oh, of course, that's no, that's the more obvious point, and that raises a whole bunch of other questions, doesn't it, about authority and who can decide what constitutes evidence and.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't want to suggest that because 27 people report having seen them, therefore the Laihoa exists, but it certainly weakens the argument that, well, somebody would have seen them by now.
Yes, no, that's right. There are other good counters, I would say, good counter arguments. One is that Homo sapiens can be pretty vicious, can come into competition directly or indirectly with, especially with closely related species, and it can lead to their extinction. It's assumed that that's what happened with. Or it's argued that that's what happened with Neanderthals.
Yeah, and I think that's not. I would never want to say that no, that could never happen. But I think it's not a very strong argument, in my opinion, to say that, well, it must have happened. There's no way that this could not have happened. The extermination of Homo Floresiensis.
People have argued about the resource base on Flores not being sufficient to support two species of Homo, but. I deal with that also in the book. These sorts of arguments, they do lead in interesting directions. I mean, one thing I think still needs some discussion is whether Homo Floresiensis really should be classified as Homo. One of the experts who first inspected, physical anthropologists first inspected the remains. Want to classify them in a new genus, not just a new species called Sundanthropus or Sunda ape, because he putting them with Australopithecines rather than Homo. But it was for reasons which themselves are fascinating. He was won over by other members of the team who wanted to call it Homo.
Okay, so that's still kind of on the table of whether we should.
I think it is very much, yeah, yeah. And of course, the Homo Floresiensis is only discovered in a single site, a single cave. They must have for a long time survived on the island in many other places, but we just don't have that evidence. Yeah.
How would you go about trying to find? Would you send a research team?
Yeah, no, simply going out, people who are much younger than me and physically fit, going out and exploring some of these mountainous forests or forested mountaintops and looking for traces. I mean, this will require, I suppose, field zoologists.
A kind of a new Jane Goodall of even more mysterious mission.
To be frank with you, I would worry about the effect on local populations. A Western team going in there, and
Of course, one worry would also be of how we would treat if we were to find Homo floresiensis.
well, very much so. And this is the, if you will, philosophical question.
And I think it raises two kinds of. One is the kind of descriptive question of how quickly would they be locked into zoos and destroyed versus a conservation area created to protect them. That's one question. But then there's also the more properly, I guess, philosophical question of what would it be like to encounter a creature that really, really is not a human in the way that we have used to think about humans, but really is not a human. I mean, it's way too close while being way too far.
Yeah.
How would we treat them like humans? Would we treat them like chimpanzees? Probably something in between. But it's just for me. I mean, I couldn't sleep almost the first night I heard about your work because I don't know what it is, but there's just something so mysterious, of course, about this in the same way as there is with any of this cryptozoology stuff or aliens, UFOs, whatever. But there is also that question of I would really want, if that is the encounter I would choose, if I could choose an encounter with a mysterious being, is with another hominin.
I like her.
Yeah. And I don't know why, and I don't know how I would react, but it really keeps me up.
I think it is an unusual case because of all these different factors coming together. The remains, the eyewitness accounts, and all the rest of it. And for my own part, the fact I was able to learn about Lahore before the remains of Homo floresiensis were discovered.
So what's your credence? What's the probability that Homo floresiensis lives?
Well, I mean, probability, I don't know. I've wondered since then. I've come to think about probability, and I've sort of discovered I don't really understand it. This statistical probability. I mean, how you would apply a measure like that to this material, I don't know. I mean, otherwise, if it's just kind of intuitive probability, it depends on who you are, your interests.
Well, what's your intuitive?
Intuitive? I really don't know. I mean, I still find it fascinating.
Yeah.
I believe I've laid out the evidence as honestly as possible in the book, and in the end, I guess it's for it's everyone individually to make up their own minds. I say it's not impossible. I've shown ways in which the undiscovered living hominin hypothesis is more plausible than some of the other ones I investigate, or all of the other ones actually I investigate in the book. So what conclusion can we draw from that? But I'd certainly be pleased if somebody discovered one, and at the same time, of course, I do have those concerns you mentioned about the fate of the things discovered. Indeed.
Okay, well, one final question. How has your research more generally, but especially around this issue, how has it shaped your view of humanity, of our species?
Well, it's led me to realize that life, the world is stranger than we thought. But we as a species, indeed, we don't understand as well as we once thought we might have. And that indeed we are just one species among many. So yeah, it's kind of humbling, really. Another obvious question is, what do we mean by humanity? You might note in reading the book that I do avoid calling Homo Floresiensis human. Okay, so they're Homo, so they're in a sense human. But it is more a philosophical question as to, what do we mean by ourselves and others.
Well, Gregory Forth, thank you so much for a really exciting book and your time today. And especially I want to thank you for giving the Leo people an honest hearing.
Now, that's exactly what I wanted to do. The book, by the way, is now available in paperback.
Okay, wonderful. And so the book is called Between Ape and Human, an anthropologist in the trail of a hidden hominoid. Is that right?
That's right, yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much one more time.
Okay, well, thank you.
So, that was it for today. If you enjoyed it and want to learn more about human evolution, different hominid creatures and how they led to us, Homo sapiens, you might enjoy episode 23 also with Jeremy De Silva. If you do enjoy the podcast in general, do make sure to subscribe to it if you haven't done so yet. Leave a nice review on Spotify or on whatever app you're using. And do consider becoming a supporter on patreon.com/onhumans. Or you can just send off one of present token of appreciation on PayPal. Links to these are in the show notes. Anyway, I hope to see you next time. Until then, take care.